welcome to this LCMS Youth Ministry webinar, where we're going to be talking about the recent survey in 2017 of LCMS young adults and their retention of LCMS young people into their home congregation and also other LCMS churches and the Christian church, and also eventually hearing from those who have also connected other places or have left the LCMS. My name is Reverend Mark Kiesling. I'm the Director of LCMS Youth Ministry. Thank you again for joining us and being a part of this conversation and a part of this information sharing. We hope that will be a blessing for you. Joining us today are DC Juliana Schultz, who's the Program Manager for Lutheran Young Adult Corps, was also a part of the research team for both studies that we'll be talking about. Also joining us is Mr. Ryan Cornett, LCMS Senior Research Analyst, who works here in St. Louis, who led the team in terms of retrieving the data, is also really getting us to some of the conclusions and also the reports that you're seeing, and we thank Ryan for his work. Also joining us is Meredith Whitefield, our communications specialist, and she'll be working with facilitation and also behind the scenes if questions come up that we'll be able to answer throughout the presentation or at the end with some Q&A. You also will meet two other people via video. That's Dr. Kevin Borchers, who is at Concordia Chicago, and also Dr. David Reeder, who is at Concordia Irvine. A little bit about the webinar, for those of you that are joining us live, is that there is a chat box. It should be on the left-hand side of your screen, that if you have questions that come out throughout the presentation, feel free to ask them there. If they're ones that we can answer right away, we'll do that in the middle of the presentation. Otherwise, we will have a time for Q&A at the end that we'll be able to answer your questions. Before we dive into the data, will you please join me in a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and for your gift of technology that enables us to be together today or to be watching this at a time that you gave us to be able to glean from our young people, to learn about our congregations in the LCMS, and to learn about the great things that your Spirit is doing with young people as they hear your word preached, as they hear your word taught, as they connect in community, and as they grow in their identity in Christ. Lord, I thank you for everyone who is here live or is watching this webinar, that I thank you for their investment in young people, for their care and love as they follow in your steps, and as they continue to help young people build in their maturity and their faith in Jesus Christ. Lord, we know we're going to be talking about a lot of numbers, whether it's this webinar or the two that are coming. But Lord, behind that, we know that there are people in churches whom you love, people whom you have called for us to support and pray for and to care for. And Lord, we pray that you keep us strong and looking out for those young people, encouraging them in their faith, teaching them from your word, and encouraging them as they walk in steps laid out by you. Lord, we thank you for the many vocations in which we are able to serve young people, and be with us in this next little time as we grow in our understanding of that work. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I wanted to talk to start a little bit of the overview of the studies that we did within the LCMS in 2017. Really a study that was pretty unprecedented for us in terms of the scope and what we wanted to accomplish. We did one that we're going to be talking about in this session, which is a confirmation survey that we did with LCMS congregations. That happened in the spring of 2017. And then another one that took place in the summer of 2017, which is where via online and social media, we reached out to young people who either were still in the LCMS or grew up in the LCMS and maybe again had left to another church or maybe left the church completely. In the next two webinars, we'll deal with that study in more detail. Just a little bit again about our research team. Again, Ryan is with us. He's our senior research analyst who works here at the LCMS. Also myself, Juliana Schultz, and then again Dr. Borchers and Dr. Reeder. Dr. Borchers at Concordia Chicago, Dr. Reeder at Concordia Irvine. And we give thanks for everyone's work on this study of making of their time and again for their love and care for the church, for the LCMS specifically, and also our young people. A little bit to frame the conversation that we had that got us into wanting to do this study was certainly a lot of questions that would come to us in LCMS Youth Ministry, sometimes very much specifically about young adults, but then also what do we learn maybe about some things with millennials with the next generation, maybe sometimes called plurals or Gen Z. And one of the things that we would hear in other studies or from our own LCMS congregations that it seemed like there was a lack of young people or a lack of millennials. Depending on what year it was when we heard that, it might be anyone aged, kind of post-college into their early 30s. And so we just took some time, Ryan did a great job of this, is just looking at our basic numbers. We are very blessed in the LCMS that we've got these great opportunities where we get kind of counts of young people and of, if you will, official acts in our church. For example, one, we may not call them births, but we have infant baptisms. So we have this opportunity to connect with young people and to see counts within our church body. We also have then our junior confirmation, which again, primarily, as we saw in our research here and other research too, is primarily in 8th grade in LCMS churches. But you might be in 9th grade, 7th grade, some other time in between. Now, one place where we didn't necessarily have a gauge that you see in other research is with high school graduations. And so this was one survey where we wanted to spend some time about how do we understand what's happening from the transition from high school into college. And so that was one of the goals we had. Well, this is just looking at some base numbers about when we talked about our millennials in our LCMS churches and why that might be. This shows a graph side by side of the numbers of total births within the United States. That is the top blue line and is using the scale on the right. And you see there the baby boom in the 50s and 60s, decline in the 70s and early 80s, and then again with the millennials, kind of another baby boom where basically levels of births were back up to what they were in the baby boom. Some of that was immigration, some of that was an improved economy, some of that, there was a number of factors that would go into that you could find multiple studies about. And that's continued into the next generation, plurals, Gen X, or Gen Z, whatever you might call that, into the 2000s. The green line that you see the decrease is the number of total baptisms within the LCMS. Again, you see that natural increase that happened with the baby boom, but then it started to decrease into the 50s and 60s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, to where essentially in the 2000s plus, we were baptizing half the number of babies that we were, say, in the early 50s. So to kind of speak to that a little bit is essentially, we talk about millennials, and sometimes the question of why did they not stay in the church, the reality is they were not there in the first place. Their parents were not bringing them to LCMS congregations, to the waters of baptism, and getting them connected into the family of Christ as young children, already as infants. So again, those young people were not there. The other piece that we looked at was not only our total number of baptisms, but then also to kind of look at, if you will, a retention rate. And just to kind of come up with, again, kind of a systematic way of looking at that, and kind of a consistent way of looking at that over years, is that we compared, if you will, baptism rates in a year, and then our junior confirmation years 13 years later. Now, certainly, there might have been a little different in the age, but to come up with a consistent number in comparison over eras of time, that was what we used. So if you would imagine we looked at maybe baptisms in 1960, and we compared it with confirmations in 1973 to see how our numbers were comparing in this retention from just baptism through the end of confirmation. And what we saw there on this survey as well is, again, a pretty major decrease in the retention rate, to where now from just baptisms to confirmations, we are seeing only about 50%, if you will, matriculate through and retain from confirmation to the end of from the baptism to the end of confirmation. And those were much higher, as you see from the graph here, back in the baby boom era, as high as in the 70s, 80s, numbers that we would see, 80%. So there's this also other retention issue that we wanted to look into with millennials. What had transpired in their time in the church? So we saw about retaining children into adulthood of about 1 to 3. We'll talk about more of that in detail. Low retention of baby boomers into adulthood as well. So it was not just millennials, but other generations too. That we saw that again, that then the millennials, as one generation became more disconnected with the church, that became the smallest segment of Synod's confirmed membership. And then certainly our concern, too, as millennials now start their own families, would that cycle continue to potentially be seen in their children? And what does that mean for LCMS congregations? And how do we reach out to those families and reconnect with them? And then, as well, is to be thinking about then those future generations, those kids that are now in our high school programs, middle school confirmation, and younger, and those children on the way. How are we preparing our churches to be a welcoming place for them and to be able to find them in our communities and be able to welcome them in the name of Jesus Christ? We're going to be talking about a number of beliefs and a number of thoughts and maybe some quotes for some young people. And maybe this will even be more so in the second and third webinar. But we do want to start with just a little disclaimer about some things that we are saying in relation to our teaching and our connection with young people. I'm just going to read this disclaimer that we have. We write, "It is well known that many in our culture, especially young people, hold views that are opposed to the Bible and the church. This study seeks to help the church learn more about these differences. This is not in any way to suggest the church is considering changing its stance or turning away from sound biblical teaching. Rather, this study is an exercise in careful listening so that church leaders and ministers are equipped to defend doctrine while compassionately engaging the whole spectrum of viewpoints found throughout this diverse generation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Mark. In this webinar, we're going to be talking most specifically about the survey that went out to congregations, and this was about confirmation. We heard from 184 LCMS congregations, specifically talking about their confirmation processes that took place. Most of the people that we heard from were the pastors in these congregations, about 86%, and almost all of them were professional church workers, with DCEs being the next biggest group. This was 184 congregations, was about 10% of the entire sample that we tried to hear from 1,800. We actually had to sample twice because we weren't getting as much as we wanted the first time around. And part of the reason that we probably didn't get a better response is because this survey actually required a lot from the person filling it out, so there was a heavy burden if they did it. And so if you were one of the people who filled out this survey, thank you very much, because it was a lot of work, but it was important work. Part of the reason it was a heavy burden was we had them look at the confirmation records from over 10 years ago. We talked about the years 2004 to 2006. Those youth confirmed in those years would now be about 23 to 27 years old. Well, now they'd be even older. At the time of this survey, they would have been about 23 to 27 years old. But one thing we found was that nearly a quarter, 23% of these congregations that filled out the survey did not have usable records from those years. Whether they may have had records and couldn't access them or couldn't read them, or maybe they didn't have records at all, but nearly a quarter did not have records that they could use. Another thing that went along with that was that many of the church workers, many of the pastors who filled out the survey were not present back at that time. And we had expected that, so we also advised them as they filled it out to seek the advice of a staff member or even parents or other lay leaders who were present, that they could be able to speak about some of the individuals in those records. In all, about half of the church workers were present at the congregation during those years, 2004 to 2006, so the same pastor or DCE was present, and that person filled out the survey. And for another portion, they did seek help. So between seeking help or being personally present themselves, we had 2/3 of our respondents were at the congregation. But another third, just over a third, 35%, were not present at the congregation and did not actually have that kind of help. And one thing that this opens up is this idea that there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to retention. There are individuals, as we'll talk about in just a minute, who the church that confirmed them does not know where they are at. And we know that with the changing of church workers, that sometimes these records are absolutely important in order to have any sort of idea of who has been through that church or not. But we also see a strong correlation then between congregations where the same pastor today, or the same pastor in 2004 to 2006 is there today. They are much more likely to know where those young people are. They're much more likely to have that personal relationship and connection with them personally. 75% know where, say it the other way around. These pastors know where 75%, so 3/4 of these young people are today. Whereas in the cases where the pastor is new to the congregation, so arrived after those years, that number dips below 60%. So almost half of the students, they do not know where they are, a phenomenon that we will refer to as their whereabouts are unknown, specifically regarding worship habits. And over overall, we see this carried through. We see a major difference in retention for congregations where the same pastor is still present versus congregations that have had that staff change. But still, despite all these unknowns, we do see a strong indication that retention is right around 33% retained from confirmation moving forward. Whether that is present at the local congregation that confirmed them or at another LCMS congregation somewhere else. So we consider that retention as well. We see that number right around a third for the entire sample that was surveyed. That bottom group in gray, that is, on this chart, those are those young adults who the current worship status is unknown. And we see a great disconnect between pastors who were not present, so newer pastors to that congregation versus those who remain. A large increase in terms of the number of whereabouts unknown. Now, this one-third number corresponds well with what we see in other research. I would especially point out the Pew Religious Landscape Survey found around that same number of level of retention, 1 and 3. And that number is actually, according to Pew, stayed fairly consistent over generations, including Generation X and the baby boomers. So as we move forward, we're going to talk specifically about some contexts in which the data plays out. And I'm going to pass it over to Juliana to talk about some of these.
Thanks, Ryan. So we're going to talk about some areas specifically that we targeted with our questions as a part of the survey. So one of the questions that we asked our congregations to tell us is if they were connected in any way to a Lutheran school. We don't know exactly what the part of that Lutheran school is, so it's possible that it was a preschool, a grade school, a high school, an association school, but we wanted to know if they had some connection to a school. And we did find that congregations with schools retained more of their young people through high school to that high school graduation age. You can see in this chart that congregations with schools fared better in terms of the number of young adults that they were able to keep post-confirmation through graduation, which is encouraging. It gives us this idea that schools do tend to have bigger confirmation classes. They do tend to stay with the congregation a little bit longer, allowing us to have a more opportunity to share with them both the gospel and to help work with them through transitions into college. We did see a loss for churches with schools after graduation. In fact, most of the loss we see in retention happens at graduation, just post-graduation. So it's not smooth. We don't see a significant piece over the long haul, but we do see that schools do help us retain through high school graduation. Again, one of the questions that we asked was, have you made programmatic changes? Have you made curricula changes? Have you made staffing changes to your church in the time since you confirmed these young people? And so we were able to see retention versus these kinds of changes that congregations attempt to make in order to be able to better educate and retain our young people. One of the most significant things we saw was that if you added youth ministry staff, you retained a much higher level of young people through graduation and into the future, into the current state of whether they were at their home congregations or not. If you change youth ministry staff, that effect diminished a little bit, and if you reduced that youth ministry staff, it was even more telling. If you look at that blue line on this chart, that's confirmation students who are still present at the home congregation. Again, you see if they added staff, that line is much higher. If they change staff, it's a little lower, but still in between that is if you reduce staff, then it was significantly lower. The red line there is those that left before graduation. That's diminished for those that added youth ministry staff, and then it's much greater for those that reduced youth ministry staff. This has a great impact in thinking about how we resource youth ministry, the kind of attention that a staff person can bring to youth ministry, and the ways that that kind of resourcing and attention could have a dramatic impact on retention of young people in our church body as they go through high school and beyond. Another link that we were able to find was talking about young leaders in the church. We asked the age of the youngest leader in your church. We were looking specifically for churches that had leaders who were in their 20s and early 30s as a way to indicate that they have value and that they are lifting up young adults into leadership. Now, one of the things that you might see here in that first part of that chart that says not significant is the percentage of young adults that were a part of the worshiping body. So we want to take off the table that this impact was because there were just more young adults in the congregation. The impact is actually having the young adults in leadership roles. And those leadership roles could be staff, but primarily those leadership roles were lay leader roles. Youth ministry, Sunday school, ushering, board work, anything that lifted them up into some position that allowed them to have influence and impact on the congregation. That was really what made the huge difference. We have young adults who joined the church and young adults who still were retained in the church, worshiping regularly there after graduation. Both saw a significant increase when there were young leaders present in the church. Also, we see a significant drop in young people leaving before graduation in churches that had young leaders. So it helps in both retention and in attraction of young adults to have those young leaders in the church, somebody for them to look to, somebody for them, a way for them to see themselves in the church body as they grow older, and not just way down the road. So this one is, again, we'll come back to it a little bit later and talk about some practical pieces of that, but this was a significant data point for us in terms of understanding what kinds of things we can be doing actively as a church body to retain those young adults through confirmation and into young adulthood. We're going to mention just a real quick quote. This is going to be stealing a little bit of thunder from the next webinar that we'll be doing. We'll talk about the young adult survey. We did ask them to answer some questions for us that were specific to why they stayed in the church or why did they leave the church. This quote came out, it said, "None of the church leaders asked me to help serve in the church at all. No one asked me to teach Sunday school when I had just gotten out of college studying to be a DCE. The church is dying because no one wants to ask for help with ministry from somebody my age, 28. This is a young woman who is now non-denominational, left their church body. I think it's telling that she is pointing out that she has the skills, she has the willingness, but in fact, no one's inviting her to serve and to join in leadership, and that is something that had a dramatic impact on her, and we can see from the data has a dramatic impact on young adults in general. We're going to pass this next section back to Ryan. He's going to talk a little bit about location.
Right. So the other aspect of some of the influential factors we looked at had to do with the context that the congregation is in. And some of these things are not necessarily easy to change, but we did see that depending on the context, there are certain strengths or advantages that differ from context to context. In the first case, we're going to look at the difference between community types, so suburban, rural, urban areas. And what we see from the data from these congregations that responded is that the suburban churches, they tended to retain more, both retain the young people in their own congregation, or if the young people left, they still continued going to an LCMS church. And so that was more likely to happen with young people who were confirmed in suburban churches. And while rural churches did not see as many stay in their own church, they were much more likely to still be connected to them, to know where they are today. And that's the green line shows the number who they've lost touch with. And so while suburban churches do tend to retain more overall, these rural churches remain better connected. And so there are different advantages or different strengths that congregations in different communities might have, we see the same thing play out in terms of size, where larger congregations, just larger in general, tended to retain more, both, again, at their local congregation, or if the young people grew up and moved away, where they went, they continued to go to an LCMS church. Congregations that were smaller did not necessarily see as many get retained in that local congregation, but they were much more likely to remain connected to them, to know where they were. And so again, we see this this may be an advantage in reaching out, in staying connected with families and reconnecting with these young people. And in terms of what we're talking about with large, or what does large mean, there's not necessarily a threshold, a certain point at which you are a large congregation, but this second chart, the scatter chart here that you see in blue, shows that it's just a general trend. The larger a congregation gets, the greater a percentage of their young people that they retained. And so we see that play out, that it's not necessarily a certain threshold, but just growth or being large in general. We also ran statistical tests to identify independent predictors. And so these are all aspects that passed statistical tests to show that they were influencing or had an influence of direct relationship with retention, not affected by other variables in the data. And most of these are ones we've already talked about, but these are the strongest factors that we found. First is having a large number of young adults who join after high school. Now, that may not seem like a predictor since it's something that happens after, but statistically, it does lead to a prediction of churches that retained those that they confirmed. And what this probably speaks to is having a congregation that is attractive to young adults in general, where they have a positive experience. So the ones who grow up there are likely to remain LCMS, and the ones who did not necessarily grow up there are attracted and continue to join. We also see that having a reduced number of confirmands who leave before graduation, so having better retention up until graduation, leads to a critical mass that plays out in retaining more young adults into adulthood. Again, being a larger congregation was one of the main predictors of having higher retention, and that is even when we control for size. So looking at the percentage of young adults that stay, larger congregations were more likely to produce more that lasted in the LCMS. But overall, the biggest factor that we saw statistically were these congregations that had young adult leaders in visible or decision-making roles. Getting young adults involved in the core of the church, specifically, we did see a threshold really at the age 32. Congregations that had young adult leaders who were 32 years old or younger being involved were much more likely to have had higher retention of the young adults that grew up in that church. Along with that, it might be interesting to point out that there were some factors that we expected to see significant influence, and it was not actually there in the data. And one of those was the age of the senior pastor. And this is somewhat surprising given the emphasis on young leaders, that the age of the senior pastor does not have a positive or negative effect on retention, whereas just having young leaders does. So that may be encouraging to a lot of congregations who may have older or much younger pastors, or maybe wondering if the age, whatever that age is of their pastor, might be influencing the retention. We don't see that reflected in the data. Another aspect that wasn't reflected in the data was making changes to the confirmation process or to youth ministry or youth-related programming, as long as it was other than staff changes. A lot of the congregations we surveyed had actually made changes, have tried to improve, have done different things, and most of that, in general, did not have a measurable impact on retention, specifically other than staff changes, as we talked about. And another aspect that did not have, surprisingly, an effect on retention was the presence of local colleges. Colleges would draw in young adults, would also, communities with colleges more likely to retain the young adults in that community, but we didn't necessarily see any statistically significant impact on retention or even attraction of new young adults in areas that have a local college. And this is sort of played out in some of the things we heard from our young adults who spoke, talking about where they live and not having college ministries. This one young lady wrote that she goes to a major university, and there are a ton of churches here. And one LCMS church, I spent my first semester going there. There were maybe 20 people in the congregation, and not one said hi to me the entire time I was there. The pastor never learned my name, even though I would shake his hand and talk to him before and after church each week. I went to 2 college group events, and maybe 5 people showed up, including the pastor. The church makes me feel very uncomfortable. Another example, my home church is in a college town, but to my knowledge, there is minimal, if any, college outreach. There are few, if any, people close to my age. So, again, we see that this impact of colleges, which we might expect to be a driving force in both retention and attraction, is not actually playing out. I'll pass it back to Mark.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. So for a few of the conclusions, again, to repeat where we saw some of the data, making some connections with us as LCMS churches, and also the programs that we see going on from Confirmation and also youth ministry, really created some great opportunities for discussion. We first revealed this data at the 2018 LCMS Youth Ministry Symposium in January of 2018, and we were able to engage in some questions there to help us bring out some kind of important points that we saw, as well as to refine that a little bit. So here's some of the concluding points, again, that we want to affirm that we saw in the data. Again, that piece of what we see from LCMS congregations, that 1/3 of LCMS are retained, and we give thanks to God for that. As you'll see in the future webinars, young people who are strong in their faith, who love their community, who love Jesus, who love serving others, and love to connect closely with other Christians. 1/3 that we know who have left, and then also 1/3 that is unknown. And in that 1/3 unknown is some thoughts we kind of got to wrestle with a little bit in terms of our record keeping and in terms of where those young people are at. But as we saw there too, at least 11% of those left worshiping in another Christian denomination. And one thing we want to lift up about that is how are we as LCMS congregation keeping doors open? Some of those stories that we heard in the other report was that, hey, I moved to an area where there weren't LCMS congregations because of my job or whatever, and how are we making sure we're keeping those relationships so that maybe if they move again, there's a connection that can be made. But we also give thanks that so many of those who are in other Christian denominations would talk about, many times positively, about their time growing up in the LCMS. Another piece, too, is every size of the community has different benefits and struggles. Ryan touched on that, about again, that connectedness that can be seen in rural and smaller churches. But then also what are some places where maybe some larger suburban churches can focus on and see where their strengths might be in retaining and also attracting young people. Staff and leadership make a difference. We'll talk about more of that here in a minute. And then also this profile of a typical congregation with higher retention and review. Larger congregation, one that operates a school, one that has ministry staff related to youth ministry, one that has that consistent pastor and leadership over a decade, incorporated young people in the service, and continues to attract young adults. As I said in the opening, we have some other members of part of our research team. One of those is Dr. Kevin Borchers, who's in the DCE program at Concordia, Chicago. He's going to give a few thoughts he had from looking through the data, and he was also one of our presenters at the symposium in January. Just 1 minute.
Hi everyone, It's good to be with you today. There are some things in the Congregational study that we really should celebrate. Nearly a third of all the young adults still worship as part of an LCMS church. And almost a quarter of the young adults still worship as part of another Christian church. Now, while we might prefer that all of them remain a part of our LCMS tribe, we can still give thanks to God that they continue to follow Christ as part of the Christian church. When we first began discussing the findings of this study, Dave Reeder and I could not help but notice that nearly 30% of the young adults were missing in action. 23% of the young adults came from congregations that had no written or digital records, and nearly half of the pastors were not even serving in the congregation when the young adults were confirmed. Now, while we cannot say that the lack of church records or staff turnover caused these young adults to go missing, we could not help but see that they had slipped through the cracks, and that was the result of something that we characterized as unintentional neglect. We called it unintentional neglect because it's not something that anybody did on purpose. It's an unfortunate occurrence, but it is something that we believe might have been happening for several generations, as much as 50 or 60 years. So what can we do about it? First, we need to remember that congregations must comply with the laws that affect 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit corporations. That's what the IRS classifies our churches. We're required to maintain accurate membership and financial records, which are linked together under federal regulations regarding financial donors. This is something that's worth checking to in your congregation. Second, the lack of accurate membership records hinders the ability of pastors and other church workers to identify members of their flock for whom they're responsible to care. This is especially true in times of staff transition. We're called to minister to all, not just those who are present on Sunday mornings. Accurate records are a great resource that we can use in this process. As for the length of the time that a person ministers in one congregation, we recognize that people retire, they take calls to another church, or they move out of town. However, we want to point out that Tom Rayner reported that there's a strong connection between the pastor serving in one congregation for a long period of time and the overall health of the congregation. Rayner also indicated that it can take 5 to 7 years before church members embrace you as one of their ministers. Long-term ministries provide necessary time that it takes to develop these deep, influential relationships in the congregation and in the community. Longer relationships have a greater probability that our discipleship efforts will bear lasting fruit and help to keep our youth connected. Ministry is about relationships, but we cannot afford to underestimate the extent to which keeping good records and serving long-term in one congregation supports and contributes to our abilities to build these relationships and to keep our young people connected in the faith.
Kevin, for his words there, and certainly one of the kind of words that he uses that was something that we grappled with some at the symposium and in other contexts is that concept of unintentional neglect. And how can churches maybe turn that into intentional connection? How can we use our records to not just to be about gleaning or being accurate, but also for that as a connection for us to make sure that those relationships are being built and that we know where our young people, our families are at, where we can serve them in times of transition and need. As well as the thing that he points on too is how can congregations and church workers themselves be connected in times of transition. We see that in the other research of somehow unintentionally people can fall through the crack. And so how can we help young people when there is a change in leadership to walk through that? One of the factors that we saw in the other study was that when churches handle conflict or change well or minister in times of change, that there was a very positive connection to that. And so how can we help when, again, our leaders do change? let's not take for granted that relationships happen with pastors and DCEs and teachers and also lay people who may move or take another job someplace else. How do we make sure that we understand that what's happening in there and that the relationship is still there and there's people caring for them in the body of Christ? As well as, for new church workers walking into situations, again, that they take time to look through those records to understand those who maybe become a little disconnected over years, that this is a fresh time, the opportunity to introduce themselves and connect with the sheep there at their church. The next video that we have is from Dr. Reeder. He also is going to talk about some of the things that he saw in the data and that were important to him.
Hello, just want to offer a couple of quick thoughts on the webinar and some of the content that you've been digesting over the last, I don't know how many minutes or whatever. Just want to offer a couple quick thoughts. One is focused on the question of record keeping. It was something that jumped out at us when we were looking at the numbers, and just that 23% of our congregations are not even reporting that they have records from the time period we're examining for confirmation. This is basic, guys. This is simple stuff. But here's the key to it. When you're looking at how it is you do the record keeping, keep in mind that what we're talking about here is critical and valuable relationships. How does the records, how do the way in which you keep the records, how do they enhance the relationship that you have with the youth and future young adults that are part of your congregation? In the future, I'm hoping to put out a little explanation on at least a method I might recommend for record keeping, so watch out for that. Secondarily, when it comes to staff retention and the value that you see in the data explaining staff retention and the way in which the retaining of staff that focus on youth ministry and they care for young adults, how much that helps to solidify the relational connection that a young adult has to the church. And there's three aspects of this to help with staff retention. It comes down to trust, respect, and purpose. And this is trust, respect, and purpose as it focuses from the leadership, the top level, senior leadership, to subordinates, and how it works within the team across staff on the same level, as well as how that works with regard to your staff and the way they relate to congregation and school families. It's essential. All three of those have to be present: trust, respect, and purpose.
Trust, respect, and purpose, certainly important words that came out with talking about staff and also other, certainly adults that rally around young people. We see that when we talk about institutional connectiveness of maybe millennials, that when that trust and respect and purpose is there, there's a great connection to institutions. And so what a blessing it is to be able to see that addition, that data that showed with staff who have that longevity, that there is that great connectivity that continues, conversations that happen. There's also connection to area churches. Going to throw it over to Juliana with a little bit more on leadership.
Jumped in too early. And I do want to add one point here, and I think because we have a question on it, I think it applies to this slide in particular. One of the things that we also want to recognize is there's some limitations to the data we're presenting to you today. We couldn't ask about lay leaders or the longevity of lay leaders or how many lay leaders are involved in your youth ministry, or maybe we should, we didn't. But so what we can tell you from our data is that adding staff and staff longevity makes a difference. I would speculate, and again, Ryan's in the room, so I have to say I'm speculating here. The data doesn't say this, but that also would be true for your lay leaders. The more lay leaders you have leading in your congregation, the more adults you have investing, whether they're on your staff or not, the more adults investing in the lives of your young people, the better your retention is going to be. We can see that in other research as well. The longer that those lay leaders stay with those young people, I see examples of this, lots of churches where they have a long-term volunteer who's been there doing youth ministry for years and years and years. That does have a pronounced effect on retention as well. We can't see that in our data because we didn't ask it, but I do think it's something that we can certainly say we can speculate would have an impact as well. we want to talk a little bit, again, about young adults and leadership, and encouraging those young adults to become leaders within your congregation. One of the things that we did that was a precursor study to this research was to talk to our Orange Nation young adult volunteers from the gathering. We had about 600 of them take a research piece at the 2016 gathering, and over 90% of them reported that they felt prepared to be serving in their congregation. So these are young adults who are active in their LCMS congregations. They report a high level of worship and Bible study. They're saying they are wanting, or they feel ready to be in service and leadership, but only 20% of them said that they actually had a leadership role. So I would suggest that we kind of look around your congregation and find those young adults, the ones that are active and involved in your ministry, and engage them in some leadership position. Put them on a board and just throw them on there just to have a young adult leader, but get to know them, mentor them, find their gifts and skills, foster and mentor into that leadership role so that they can have opportunities to have a say. And as they do that, be willing to answer questions, because they're going to have a lot of them, and be willing and open to making changes as they may lead differently than generations in the past. They may take a different approach than generations in the past. Young people today have grown up with technology, and they're going to utilize that in different ways than perhaps the church has seen in its leadership in the past. So that can be hard. There can be a lot of struggles within that, but it's a struggle worth having because we feel it's really important to be encouraging and mentoring young leaders. And for those young adults that you're raising up into leadership, help find older adults who are willing to be in relationship with them as a part of that process. Debriefing leadership tasks with them, mentoring and walking along with them as they do that. We're not suggesting we hand it all over all at once, but that you're walking along with them, guiding them, ensuring that they are growing in their faith as they do that and that they have that solid foundation. These are all really practical things that you can hopefully start to look at now, things that you can start to talk about in your congregations and within leadership groups. One of the things that we'll provide in the Dropbox is a conversation guide that you can use in many different ways, ways for you to be talking about how these practical pieces can start to be applied in your congregation and how you can think about what we learned in this data and how that applies to your specific context. I think at this point, we are going to take some questions. So for those of you that are here, and I do think we do have a few of you who are here, if you look at that attendee chat there on the left-hand side, there's a place for you to type in questions that you might have them. We do have one that we haven't addressed yet there from Kevin about leadership. And for those of you that are on audio, when discussing those who get into leadership, there's an example noted of a young lady who left for a non-denominational church, and that would seem to be a problem with her confession and not her skills. What are your thoughts? Should we standardize leadership requirements for paid and volunteer youth leaders? Interesting, thoughtful question there, Kevin. I can hear you guys want it.
Good.
Okay. I mean, I will start here, and I'll be curious if you have more to add to this after I say this. Please keep typing. But I would say this young lady put that down as an answer to the question, why did you leave? Which would suggest that she's talking about not being added into leadership in a time before she left the LCMS. Could there have been a breakdown in her understanding of theology before that? Certainly. And I think we want to have a standard for all of our volunteers, lay-in and staff, in terms of their understanding of Lutheran doctrine and their own faith lives. I would say, yeah, we want to have a standard. We want to make sure that the lay leaders and our staff are actively in worship, that they're partaking in the sacraments, that they're in personal Bible study and prayer on a regular basis. We would expect to see that for any lay leader, and I would expect that of any young leader that you're lifting up. We want to make sure that their personal faith life is fruitful, that they're attached to the vine, that they're growing in their faith, as a part of them being in leadership. It's hard to be a leader in a church without having those things. But we also want to make sure that we're engaging all of those that are there and not just the most obvious people in order to be in leadership. So I'm curious if that answers your question or not. You can feel free to type more here. I'm not seeing any other questions. Mark, do you want to speak to that as well?
I've done a flip side from the congregational standpoint, too. I'm not sure necessarily who you're asking about, who should have the standardized leadership requirements. But is that, too, from a church, so that there is a connection for a young person to get connected, or anyone, that even having their standard requirements so that when they show interest, there's a way to get them connected and say, well, do you fit these requirements? So it's not just continually being put off, but have churches think through. When we want volunteers, we'll have a process in how that can happen, whether it's, again, a conversation about theological understanding, whether it's experience, whatever it might be. But for the church to be able to lift up these leaders, regardless of age, so that they've got through that process so that you have good, qualified staff and also volunteers who are working with young people. So I think there's a conversation on both ends of that.
Right now, how long? Okay. Any other? I'm trying to think. Are there things that we didn't talk about? I'm curious, Ryan. What for you? You've looked at this data how many times now? What is the most practical suggestion you can give congregations at this point?
Well, two things pop to mind, and one of them has been hit on. Both of them have been hit on quite a bit. And the first is record keeping. Keeping. So surprised. But keeping better records, both so that the church knows what's going on, but also so that we know who these individuals are. I mean, not necessarily us, but the next ministers at the church, the next pastors, the next DCEs, and the other really is involving young people in the core of the church. It doesn't, we looked at the specifics of these leadership roles. We asked who is the youngest leader at your church and what are they doing, and the responses we got did include some, cases where they were elders in the church, they were on the boards. In a couple cases, the youngest person was the pastor, but in a lot of times it was just a visible position, a teaching role, working with youth, working with children, working with the music in the church, being a trustee, being a decision maker in some aspect of the church. And so a visible or decision-making role in the church, really getting these young people involved. They are adults now. They are, most of them are in their career fields and not in school anymore. They're in the real world and they're ready to be treated as adults. And I think that's key.
Well, and to be able to see that the age of your pastor doesn't make a huge difference. Was really interesting because I think there's some instinct in us that says if I have a younger pastor that somehow will attract younger people, and the reality is that it's the relationship that they have with their pastor that makes the most significant difference. When we did our YAB survey, an astronomical number of young adults said, my pastor cares for me personally. And it tells us that when young adults are active in their congregations, part of the reason they are is because their pastor has that personal care and connection with them. And that happens regardless of your pastor's age. And so I think that, again, it goes back to those relationship things and not necessarily more of the programming pieces of that as well. Mark, any?
Yeah, I think it's along with that. I think seeing through that longevity of service, that in some ways that's a no-brainer, but to see it statistically, to talk about that there's that value in those relationships that are made and just allowing that trust to happen between church and church worker and to where those relationships are built. And I think that speaks probably overall to the health of the church as well in terms of how are they caring for each other, living together in the body as the body of Christ. And so what a beautiful picture that is of that relationship with young people.
I got a question here. I'm going to read it on the fly here. Well, I'm not seeing it in the data you passed out. We were at Best Practices in Ministry last month. In the data, you're seeing any insight between the retention of students, young adults, and the segmentation of age groups within the congregation.
Yeah, I don't think we would necessarily have research on that from the survey necessarily. That would speak to that. That is part of some of our maybe follow-up focus group stuff in terms of what did Christian education look like growing up. But in terms of that actually being in the survey, Sean, I don't think we would be able to pull that out.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we weren't able to ask, unfortunately. Even in hindsight, even as we analyze the data that we do have, there's lots of times where we can draw some conclusions, but we also can't draw straight lines that we go, okay, we know these two things are true. We don't know how they play into each other. We can think about that staff retention or adding staff versus losing staff, and was it that young adults left and then we lost the staff, or did we lose the staff and then we lost the young adults? We can't know that for sure. We know that adding staff helps, so the opposite should play true, but there's a lot. All of this stuff is interactive and it's all contextual, and so we're going to try and give you broad strokes throughout this research and all three of these webinars, but we want to use these discussion guides and other opportunities to help you contextualize what that means for your location. It's going to depend. So sorry for all the data we can't give you.
I will say anecdotally, because we saw this in National Study of Youth Religion and other studies too, that actually we do, as the LCMS, retain pretty well up through high school in terms of those age. And at least some other people have come back to us in the LCMS, knowing us well, and what we do, have said, well, they really thought one of the reasons why is because we do, by and large, love worshiping together as families, as family units. That was at least one of the things, again, not necessarily highly research-based, but yet nonetheless, that was one thing that when they would compare churches, and they'd say, LCMS churches don't seem to do that a lot. Now, that could be because they're relatively smaller churches across the board on the average. It could be a lot of things that go into that. But yet, nonetheless, they say, well, you get together and you are in worship together. And so you don't necessarily have the segmentation as much as you're talking about that maybe you might see in other traditions or other maybe larger churches.
Great question. Yeah. Let's see, any other? Anything surprising from the data, guys, that you saw? Anything you didn't expect?
I think probably, I think some of them along the line of, I'll be honest, I was hoping for a little bit maybe of a silver bullet about changing some programs. Maybe we're going to be able to get more data on that and be able to say, hey, let's dig deeper into this and let's contact these churches and let's find out what they did. But so I guess I would say don't change for change's sake. I think maybe with purpose and there's reason to do it, maybe it works, but definitely don't change for change's sake. So that was one that I was a little surprised about. I thought we might get more. And then the one, too, I think was one of the last ones Ryan said, it was the presence of local colleges. So what does that mean about that retention piece, and how are we still developing those relationships with young people as we prepare them to leave their home church and go into college, and how do we continue to do that better?
I would definitely agree with that. I think that seeing the things that did make a difference, and seeing that leadership and adding staff had such a positive impact, to then see that other changes to the curriculum, to the programming, didn't. So non-relational based changes to the programming didn't make a difference. And then the age of the senior pastor not making a difference when leadership was so strong is surprising, but I think also encouraging in that example.
Well, and I think I was surprised, and this is that weird statistic or predictor that Ryan mentioned at the beginning, this idea of if you are attracting young adults, you're retaining young adults. and I think I had to read it over about 65 times before I ever really grasped it, was, this measure of health. A healthy congregation is attracting young adults, and a healthy congregation also retains young adults. And so really the key there is being not specific about location or size or any other, whether you're rural or urban or suburban, or if you're large or you're small. If you're attracting young adults from your area, you're probably retaining young adults in your area. And so using that as a marker of health could be helpful for us kind of moving forward. I think we're still trying to parse that out a little bit, or at least I'm still trying to parse that out a little bit, because there's a lot of speculation we have to go into that. But I do think that might be helpful for us in terms of thinking through what are those things that congregations can be using as markers of whether we're doing things right or not. When there isn't a silver bullet, when there isn't a program change we can suggest, when some of this is untangible, what do we do to kind of give ourselves a place to go, okay, then this is an indicator that we're doing the right things.
Another thing that comes to mind too is how similar our findings are to other research that we're finding, and even research that's taken place outside of Lutheran contexts. Not to say that it's exactly the same, but to say that in a large part, engaging these young people as a generation, there are more similarities than there are differences, regardless of the context. So things that are coming out about millennials largely are true, whether you are in a non-Christian context or a Baptist context or a Lutheran context. As a generation, there seem to be a lot of similarities, and our data found that most of the findings that other organizations and other researchers are finding are true in this context as well.
All right. Well, just to wrap up, to remind you again that the Dropbox is available on the Facebook event page. Right now, there you're able to find the full report that, again, has more of that data you'll be able to read through, and the full summary of the research that took place with LCMS Congregation. There's, as Juliana said, a discussion and conversation guide to think through some of the questions that were raised, or also to bring that a little bit more into your context. And as well as there is then these slides from this presentation in PDF form. And for future webinars, we'll continue to add information there as well. Again, thank you for participating here live with us, but then also watching this too. Just as a reminder, we have 2 more webinars coming up in which we'll dig into the second part of the research, which was, again, surveying over 2,000 young adults. The next ones are coming up on April 19th and also May 16th, and both of those are 11 a.m. Central Time, noon Eastern. Again, thank you for your time joining us today. God bless your continued service, and we'll see you next month. Take care. God bless.